In this emotional journey, we follow Henry and Chloe as they navigate the heartbreak of their son Will's accident, which leaves him in a coma for 3 long years. As they struggle with guilt, loss, and hope, their family bond is tested in ways they never imagined. Stay with us as we explore how love, resilience, and forgiveness guide them through the darkest moments toward healing. The soft afternoon light streamed through the modest curtains of Henry and Chloe's cozy home, casting a warm glow over the living room. Their son, Will, was a whirlwind of energy, his laughter filling the room as he darted between scattered toys. Henry sat back on the couch, his gaze following Will's every move with a proud, content smile. "That boy's got more energy than I ever had," Henry said with a chuckle, glancing at Chloe. She smiled back, her eyes following Will, but her expression was laced with a hint of worry. "He's fearless, just like you," she responded, her voice gentle but cautious, ever the protector. Chloe was always the one to keep things steady, but it was hard to rein in Will's wild enthusiasm. "Careful, sweetheart," she called out as he climbed onto the back of the couch, his next adventure clearly in motion. Henry, ever the optimist, shrugged it off. "Let him be, he's got to learn." But Chloe's mind was always half a step ahead, anticipating what could go wrong. Even in their loving, simple home, she felt the weight of keeping everything in order. Will, however, was oblivious to her worry, rolling across the floor with a carefree grin. It was just another day in their small but happy world, where laughter and love filled the air. As dinner was set on the table, the soft clinking of utensils filled the small dining room. Henry and Chloe sat across from each other, the comforting rhythm of their routine settling in. Will, still full of energy, played in the living room, his toys scattered around him as he hummed to himself. Chloe glanced toward him, her mind always half-focused on keeping him safe, while Henry enjoyed the rare quiet moment. Between bites, Henry broke the silence with a thoughtful tone. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "life can change in an instant. One minute everything's fine, and the next, it's all upside down." Chloe smiled, though the words seemed to linger in the air, heavier than Henry intended. "I guess that's why we hold on tight and face things together, right?" he added, his optimism always surfacing, even in casual conversations. Chloe nodded, appreciating his steady outlook, but there was an unease she couldn't shake, even as she smiled back at him. She brushed it off for the moment, focusing on the warmth of their dinner and the sound of Will's laughter from the next room. Little did she know, Henry's words would soon take on a much deeper meaning in their lives. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows as Chloe and Will played a game of hide-and-seek in the living room. Will's giggles filled the air as he darted from one corner to another, always just out of Chloe's reach. "I'm gonna catch you," Chloe teased, her laughter mixing with his. For a moment, everything felt perfect, light and carefree. But in the blink of an eye, things changed. Will, full of excitement, clambered onto the dining room table, something Chloe usually would have stopped immediately. Distracted for just a second, she didn't notice until it was too late. A sudden thud broke the moment like glass shattering. Chloe's heart leapt into her throat as she whipped around to see Will on the floor, motionless. "Will," she screamed, rushing to his side. Her hands shook as she touched his face, her voice trembling. "Will, baby, can you hear me?" There was no response, his eyes were closed, his body limp. Panic surged through her like a tidal wave, washing over her rational thoughts. "Henry," she shouted, her voice cracking as fear gripped her. In a blur, Henry rushed in, his eyes wide with alarm as he saw Chloe kneeling beside their son. The ride to the hospital was a whirlwind of flashing lights and heart-pounding silence. Chloe held Will's small hand in hers, whispering desperate prayers between gasps of breath, her mind racing in a million directions. Henry drove, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel, stealing frantic glances at the rearview mirror. "He'll be okay," Henry repeated, more to himself than to Chloe, trying to hold on to hope. But Chloe couldn't speak, the guilt already wrapping itself around her, suffocating her. Every second felt like an eternity as they raced toward the unknown. In the emergency room, doctors swarmed around Will, their words a blur of medical jargon as they worked quickly. Chloe stood frozen, her mind unable to process the scene unfolding in front of her. Henry paced beside her, trying to hold himself together, but the cracks were beginning to show. A nurse gently took Chloe's arm, guiding her to a chair. "We'll do everything we can," the nurse said softly, but the words offered little comfort. Time seemed to stop as they waited, every beep of the machines feeling like a countdown to something Chloe wasn't ready to face. After what felt like hours, a doctor finally approached them. "It's a severe head trauma," he explained, his voice calm but serious. "We've done everything we can for now, but he's in a coma." Chloe's world collapsed with those words. A coma. The weight of it sank in slowly, like a slow-motion nightmare. Henry put his arm around her, pulling her close, but Chloe barely registered the gesture. All she could think was that she had let this happen. Her son, her baby, was lying helpless because of her failure to protect him. And now, they were facing the darkest chapter of their lives. The sterile smell of the hospital filled Chloe's senses as she sat beside Will's bed, her fingers gently brushing his small hand. Days had passed, but the scene in front of her felt frozen in time. Will lay still, hooked up to machines that monitored every breath, every heartbeat, and every subtle change. Guilt gnawed at her constantly, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. She couldn't shake the image of him falling, her one moment of distraction that led to this nightmare. Henry, ever the optimist, tried to keep the atmosphere light. "He's a tough kid, Chloe. He's going to pull through," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes betrayed the fear he tried so hard to hide. Chloe barely heard him, lost in her own thoughts. "It's my fault," she kept thinking, over and over like a broken record. She couldn't escape the loop of guilt that played relentlessly in her mind. She began to pull away, emotionally retreating, barely speaking. She couldn't face Henry's unwavering hope, it felt like salt in a wound she couldn't bear. Every time Henry tried to comfort her, she recoiled, her heart too heavy with regret. Henry noticed the change but didn't push. He dealt with the stress in his own way, holding on to hope, even as Chloe began to spiral into silence. The nights were the hardest. Chloe would sit alone in the dimly lit room, watching the machines beep softly, each one a painful reminder of how far Will was from waking up. She would think about the small things, the way Will's laughter used to fill the house, the messy piles of toys he would leave behind, the stories he would tell her before bed. Now, the silence was unbearable. She didn't know how to be the strong mother everyone expected her to be. "How can I face him if he wakes up?" she wondered. The thought of seeing his eyes and knowing he might never be the same was almost too much to bear. Henry, meanwhile, tried to hold everything together. He balanced time at the hospital with trips home to keep their lives running, but it was clear the weight was crushing him, too. "We can't lose hope, Chloe," he would say every time he returned from a visit with the doctors, trying to inject some light into the dark room. But Chloe could only nod weakly. The distance between them grew with each passing day, as Chloe buried herself in her guilt and Henry clung to a hope that felt increasingly fragile. Chloe often questioned herself late at night, wondering if she would ever find the strength to move past the guilt. The longer Will remained in the coma, the more she doubted herself. Could she ever forgive herself for what happened? Could Will? Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that moment of the fall, saw her hands reaching for him too late. It felt like her heart was trapped in a cycle of endless pain, and she wasn't sure if she'd ever escape. The road ahead seemed too dark, too uncertain, and she couldn't see a way out. After days of sitting in silence, Chloe found herself standing in front of Will's hospital room door, her heart heavy with indecision. She had spent countless hours drowning in guilt, unable to see a way forward. But something shifted inside her as she stared at his fragile body, connected to machines that hummed softly in the background. She realized she couldn't keep living like this, trapped in her regret, unable to act. Will needed her. Whether he woke up tomorrow or in months, she had to be strong for him. With a deep breath, Chloe made the decision she had been avoiding. She would stay by his side, no matter how hard it got, no matter how much pain it caused. That evening, Chloe spoke to Henry for the first time in days. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but the resolve was there. "I'm not giving up on him, Henry." "I can't," she said, her eyes filling with tears. Henry, who had been waiting for this moment, looked at her with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "I never thought you would," he replied, gently taking her hand. For the first time since the accident, they sat together without the weight of unspoken tension hanging between them. Chloe felt the smallest flicker of hope reigniting, though it was fragile, like a candle in the wind. The decision marked a new chapter for them. Their life, once filled with laughter and play, was now defined by hospital routines, therapy sessions, and the constant waiting for any sign of improvement. Chloe spent her days learning everything she could about Will's condition, speaking with doctors, researching treatments, and doing whatever she could to feel useful. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but it gave her purpose. Henry, too, adapted to the new reality, splitting his time between work and the hospital, offering Chloe support in whatever way he could. Yet, even as they faced this new challenge together, the emotional scars lingered. Chloe's guilt hadn't disappeared, it simply simmered beneath the surface. Every time she looked at Will, she was reminded of that day, of the one moment that changed everything. But now, instead of letting it paralyze her, she used it to fuel her determination. If she couldn't change the past, she would fight for the future. "We'll get through this," she whispered to Will one night, her fingers brushing his hand. "I'm not leaving you." The days stretched into weeks, and the rhythm of hospital life became their new normal. Chloe and Henry worked in unspoken tandem, finding a fragile balance between hope and reality. Some days were harder than others, when the doctors had no updates or when Chloe's exhaustion left her feeling empty. But she kept going, holding on to the small moments, like the way Will's chest rose and fell steadily as he slept, or the rare flickers of movement in his fingers. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her anchored, reminding her that there was still a chance, however small, that her son would come back to her. As weeks turned into months, the cracks in Henry and Chloe's relationship began to widen. At first, they had been united in their grief and determination, but the strain of Will's coma wore on them in different ways. Chloe, consumed by guilt, threw herself into caring for Will, spending every waking moment by his side. She barely left the hospital, even when Henry suggested she take breaks. "I'm fine," she would insist, her voice hollow, her eyes distant. But she wasn't fine, her exhaustion was evident in her pale skin, the dark circles under her eyes. Henry, on the other hand, tried to keep their life at home running, but the more he took on, the more he felt Chloe slipping away. The distance between them grew, not from a lack of love, but from the weight of everything left unsaid. Henry would come to the hospital after work, sit with Chloe, and try to talk, but the conversations always felt shallow, like they were avoiding the deeper issues. "How was your day?" he'd ask, but Chloe's answers were always brief, her focus entirely on Will. Henry missed the days when they used to talk for hours, laughing and sharing everything. Now, there was only silence, punctuated by the constant beeping of hospital machines. Chloe, in her grief, couldn't see how much Henry was hurting. She was too wrapped up in her own guilt, in the relentless self-blame that whispered in her ear day and night. Every time Henry tried to pull her back, to remind her that they were still a team, she would shut down, her eyes fixed on Will. She couldn't bring herself to tell Henry the truth, that every time she looked at him, she saw a reminder of her failure as a mother. It was easier to focus on Will, to pour all her energy into him, even if it meant pushing Henry further away. Henry, for his part, was trying to remain hopeful, but it wasn't easy. He missed Chloe, missed her laugh, missed the way she used to lean into him at the end of a long day. Now, she barely looked at him, and when she did, there was a distance in her eyes that felt like a wall between them. "I'm still here, Chloe," he said one evening, his voice tight with frustration. "I know you're hurting, but I'm hurting too. We can't go through this alone." But Chloe just nodded, her gaze never leaving Will's still form, and Henry felt more alone than ever. The weight of their shared tragedy was becoming too much. They were both exhausted, Henry from trying to keep their lives afloat, Chloe from the crushing guilt that had become her constant companion. The once loving, close bond they shared now felt like it was held together by fraying threads. Neither of them knew how to fix it, and the longer they went on like this, the further apart they drifted. The love was still there, buried beneath the pain, but neither of them knew how to reach it anymore. Their relationship, once full of light, now felt as fragile as glass, and both feared that it might shatter beyond repair. 3 years passed, each day bleeding into the next, as Henry and Chloe's lives revolved around the hospital. The once vibrant couple now moved like shadows of their former selves, their days marked by the repetitive routine of therapy sessions, doctor consultations, and long hours sitting beside Will's bed. Despite the passing of time, Will remained in a coma, and with each day, Chloe seemed to sink deeper into herself. Her dedication to Will was unwavering, but it came at the cost of everything else: her health, her happiness, her relationship with Henry. She refused to leave the hospital for more than a few hours at a time, convinced that Will might wake up in the moment she was gone. Henry tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, keeping the house in order and holding on to his job, but it was clear that the strain was getting to him. His optimism, once a beacon of light for Chloe, had dimmed. He still visited Will every day, sitting beside him and talking to him as if nothing had changed, but there was a heaviness in his voice that hadn't been there before. "You'll wake up soon, buddy," he'd say quietly, stroking Will's hair. But his words, once filled with hope, now felt more like a routine, a way to keep the darkness at bay for just a little longer. Chloe, on the other hand, became consumed by the care Will required. His condition demanded constant attention, and with every passing day, her own health began to deteriorate. She barely slept, barely ate, and refused to let anyone else take over Will's care for too long. Even when Henry suggested they hire someone to help, she resisted at first, convinced that no one could care for Will like she could. Eventually, though, she had no choice. They hired Emily, a gentle, kind-hearted caregiver who stepped in to provide some relief. But even with Emily's help, Chloe never fully trusted anyone else to be with Will. The presence of Emily brought a small sense of relief to their lives, though. With her there, Henry and Chloe could take brief moments to breathe, though Chloe still rarely left Will's side. Emily was patient with both of them, understanding the weight they carried, and did her best to ease the burden. She spent hours reading to Will, talking to him, and even playing soft music in the room. Chloe appreciated Emily's presence, but it also made her feel a sharp pang of guilt, like she was failing as a mother by letting someone else take over. As the years passed, life became a series of motions. The hospital became their second home, and the outside world faded into the background. Henry and Chloe barely talked about anything beyond Will's condition. Friends who once visited regularly stopped coming by as often, unable to break through the wall of sorrow that surrounded the family. Their love for Will remained as strong as ever, but their connection to each other had frayed. Each was lost in their own struggle, and the weight of 3 years without any change in Will's condition pressed down on them like an ever-present storm cloud. It was a quiet morning when the change finally came. Chloe sat by Will's bed as she had every day for the past 3 years, her fingers absently tracing the edge of his blanket. She had long since stopped expecting anything to happen, resigned to the routine of doctors and machines. But then, just as she closed her eyes for a moment, she heard a sound, soft, almost imperceptible. Her eyes shot open, and she stared at Will, hardly daring to breathe. There it was again, a faint sound, like a weak hum escaping from his lips. "Will?" Chloe whispered, leaning in closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "Will, baby, can you hear me?" Her voice cracked with the weight of hope and fear. She reached for the call button frantically, summoning the nurses. Henry burst through the door moments later, his face a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. "Did you hear that?" Chloe whispered, tears already streaming down her face. Henry nodded, his eyes locked on their son. It was small, just a sound, but it was something. After 3 long years of silence, it was a sign that Will was still in there, trying to come back to them. The doctors rushed in, checking the machines, their faces more serious now, but Chloe could see the flicker of optimism in their eyes as well. Days passed, and the tiny sounds Will had made turned into something more. He began to move, small twitches of his fingers at first, then his eyelids fluttered. Chloe and Henry clung to each other during those moments, their hearts racing with every new sign of life. One afternoon, as Chloe sat alone by Will's bed, he opened his eyes for the first time. It was brief, just a few seconds, but it was enough to make Chloe gasp. "Henry," she called out, her voice trembling. When Henry rushed into the room, Chloe was sobbing, holding Will's hand like she was afraid to let go. "He's waking up," she whispered, her voice filled with both joy and fear. But as Will slowly began to regain consciousness, something was wrong. Chloe could sense it even before the doctors said anything. Will's movements were hesitant, and there was a distance in his eyes, something unfamiliar and unsettling. He turned his head away whenever Chloe spoke to him, his gaze focused on the ceiling or out the window, never on her. At first, she told herself it was just the effects of the coma, that he was disoriented, confused. But when Henry spoke, Will responded, his weak voice answering his father with a hint of recognition. Chloe tried again. "Will, sweetheart, it's Mommy." "I'm right here," she whispered, her heart aching. But Will didn't respond. He didn't even look at her. Chloe's heart shattered as the days went by, and Will continued to reject her. He would speak to Henry, would nod when Emily talked to him, but whenever Chloe approached, he turned away. The doctors reassured her, saying it could be part of the recovery process, but Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was wrong. Will was afraid of her, she could see it in his eyes. The boy who had once clung to her now recoiled at her touch, and it was as if the bond they once shared had been broken. Chloe felt helpless, caught between the joy of Will's awakening and the crushing fear that she had lost him in a way she never could have imagined. As the days stretched on, the emotional distance between Chloe and Will grew more palpable. He was awake now, more alert with each passing day, but he refused to meet her eyes. One morning, as she sat by his bed, gently stroking his hand, Will pulled away for the first time. The gesture, so small yet so devastating, left Chloe frozen in place, her heart aching. "Will, it's me." "Mommy," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. But Will turned his head toward the window, his face set in a stubborn, silent rejection. The pain in Chloe's chest grew sharper each time he pushed her away, and she couldn't understand why. Henry noticed the change, too. He saw the way Will seemed to light up when he entered the room, how he responded to Emily's stories with faint smiles. But with Chloe, there was always a wall, a cold, emotional barrier. One evening, after yet another failed attempt by Chloe to connect with her son, Henry sat by Will's bedside, his voice gentle. "Hey, buddy, talk to me." "What's going on?" he asked, trying to coax out the truth. Will hesitated, his small hands clutching the edge of his blanket. "It's Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't want her here." Those words hit Henry like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone gentle but confused. Will's lips trembled as he struggled to explain. I heard her, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. When I was asleep. I heard her talking, crying. She didn't want me to wake up. Henry's heart sank as he listened, and suddenly, everything began to make sense. Will had been conscious, at least in some small way, during his coma. He had heard Chloe's guilt, her moments of despair when she thought no one was listening. And in his young mind, it had twisted into something else, a belief that his own mother had given up on him. Later that night, Henry told Chloe what Will had said. She was devastated, her face going pale as the weight of his words settled in. He thinks I didn't want him to wake up, she whispered, her voice breaking. Henry, I never said that. I never, but even as she spoke, she knew how it must have sounded to Will. There had been moments, countless moments, when the guilt had overwhelmed her, when she had spoken her darkest fears aloud, thinking Will would never hear them. I didn't mean it, she sobbed, her hands shaking. I was just scared. I was scared he'd wake up and not be the same, and I didn't know how to live with that. Chloe's heart broke all over again, realizing the depth of Will's pain. Her son, the one she had devoted every moment to, thought she had abandoned him, even while he was still in his coma. She wanted to explain, to tell him how wrong he was, how much she had fought for him. But every time she tried to talk to him, the fear and confusion in his eyes grew stronger. He didn't understand, and she didn't know how to fix it. She felt trapped, caught between her love for Will and the terrible reality that he saw her as the villain in his story. The tension between them was unbearable. Chloe tried to keep up her visits, hoping that with time, Will would come around. But every time she stepped into the room, his body tensed, and the distance between them felt like an ocean. Henry did his best to keep the peace, but even he couldn't bridge the growing divide. Chloe feared that she had lost Will in a way far worse than she had ever imagined, that even though he had woken up, he might never truly come back to her. Chloe sat in the quiet hospital hallway, tears silently streaming down her face as she wrestled with the growing chasm between her and Will. Every day, her son rejected her more, his body tensing whenever she entered the room. The thought of his once loving eyes now filled with fear and anger broke her completely. She whispered to herself, I don't know how to fix this, feeling utterly powerless. The guilt she had carried since the accident weighed heavier with each failed attempt to reconnect. Inside, Henry tried his best to keep things normal, but even he could see the growing gap between mother and son. Will smiled faintly at Emily's stories and responded to Henry's gentle jokes, but every glance Chloe gave him was met with cold rejection. Henry's heart ached for both of them, but no words of comfort could bridge the emotional distance that had formed. Chloe, once so strong and determined, now seemed to be slipping into despair, convinced she had lost Will for good. One night, Chloe collapsed in grief, telling Henry through sobs, he hates me, my own son hates me. She believed that no matter what, she had failed as a mother. Henry tried to console her, wrapping her in his arms, but Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that walking away might be better for Will. Maybe he'll heal without me around, she muttered, broken. But Henry, refusing to let her give up, held her tightly and said, no, Chloe, we're going to fix this. Together. Chloe sat alone in Will's hospital room, the soft beeping of the machines the only sound breaking the silence. Her hands rested in her lap, trembling slightly as she stared at her son, her heart heavy with a pain she could barely put into words. She had never felt so lost, so unsure of herself. The guilt was like an anchor, pulling her down into a place where hope seemed impossible. She thought back to all the moments she had spent by his side, all the prayers she had whispered, all the promises she had made. And now, after everything, Will wanted nothing to do with her. She couldn't understand how it had come to this. Chloe had always been the one to protect him, to comfort him, to make sure he knew he was loved. But somehow, in the darkness of those 3 years, that bond had shattered. Will's rejection cut deeper than anything she had ever experienced, and she didn't know how to repair it. Every time she tried to speak to him, to reach out, he recoiled, as if she were the enemy. "How do I fix this?" she whispered to herself, tears slipping down her cheeks. She felt like a stranger in her own life, watching everything she loved slip away. Chloe thought about leaving, about stepping back and letting Henry and Emily handle everything. Maybe that was what Will needed, maybe her presence was doing more harm than good. The thought of walking away, of not being there for him, crushed her, but the guilt whispered in her ear that she had already failed as a mother. How could she stay when all she seemed to bring him was pain? The idea gnawed at her, leaving her feeling like she was trapped in a terrible, unwinnable situation. Maybe he'd be better off without me, she thought, the words twisting like a knife in her heart. But as the night wore on, a small voice inside her refused to let go. She thought of Will as a baby, of the countless nights she had spent rocking him to sleep, of the love that had always flowed between them. That love hadn't disappeared, it couldn't have. Chloe knew that deep down, Will was still the same boy, her son, and she couldn't let him slip away, no matter how hard things were. She had been lost in her guilt for too long, and if she didn't fight now, she might lose him forever. "I can't leave him," she whispered, her resolve slowly hardening. "I won't leave him." By the time dawn began to break through the hospital windows, Chloe had made a decision. She wouldn't run away from this, no matter how hard it was. She needed to find a way to reconnect with Will, to show him that she hadn't abandoned him, even if he believed she had. She knew it wouldn't be easy, he had built walls around his heart, and breaking through them would take time. But for the first time in weeks, Chloe felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't going to give up. Not on Will, not on her family, and not on herself. Chloe sat at the small desk in Will's hospital room, a piece of paper in front of her and a pen in hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she began to write, her thoughts tumbling onto the page in messy, hurried script. She had decided that if Will couldn't hear her words in person, maybe he could read them. Maybe if she poured her heart out on paper, he would understand. The first words were the hardest, but she knew she had to start with honesty. "Forgive me, Will," she wrote, her heart heavy with each letter. It was the beginning of a series of letters she would write to him every day, hoping that somehow, through these small gestures, she could start to rebuild the trust they had lost. Each letter was left beside his bed, where Will could find it when he was ready. The first few days, Will didn't touch them. He barely glanced in her direction when she placed the folded notes on his bedside table, his expression distant and cold. But Chloe didn't stop. Every morning, she wrote another, pouring out her apologies, her love, and her regret. She told him stories of their life before the accident, of how much he had meant to her, and how she had never stopped loving him, even in her darkest moments. It became a ritual for Chloe, a way to fight the silence between them, a way to reach him without overwhelming him. As the days passed, something shifted. One afternoon, Chloe noticed that the first letter was missing from the pile. Will had taken it. Her heart leapt in her chest, though she tried to stay calm, knowing this was only a small step. But it was enough to give her hope. Over the next week, the other letters slowly disappeared, one by one. Will still hadn't spoken to her, still hadn't looked her in the eyes, but Chloe knew he was reading them. He was hearing her words in his own time, at his own pace, and that gave her a fragile sense of hope she had been missing for so long. Finally, one morning, Chloe walked into the room to find Will holding one of the letters in his hands. He wasn't reading it, just holding it, staring out the window. She approached slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what to say. For the first time in what felt like years, Will turned to look at her, his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen before, curiosity, maybe even a little understanding. Chloe swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I sit with you?" she asked, her heart racing. Will didn't answer, but he didn't turn away either. It was a start. Over the next few days, the tension between them began to ease, if only slightly. Will didn't speak much, but he allowed Chloe to sit with him while he read her letters. Slowly, carefully, Chloe started to talk to him again, not about the accident or the guilt, but about the small things, the stories he used to love, the adventures they used to dream of together. Bit by bit, the walls that had grown between them started to crack. Chloe could feel it, there was still so much work to do, but this was the moment she had been waiting for. It was the first step toward healing, for both of them. One afternoon, weeks after Chloe had begun writing her letters, the hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the machines. Will sat in bed, a soft light from the window casting gentle shadows across his face. Chloe sat beside him, her heart heavy but steady, a letter in her hand. She hesitated, unsure if she should say what had been on her mind for days. Will, still quiet but no longer closed off, glanced at her, sensing the weight of the moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "Will, I need to tell you something important." Chloe took a deep breath, feeling the words catch in her throat. "I'm so sorry," she began, her voice cracking. "For everything. For not being there the way you needed me. For letting my fear and guilt take over when I should have been stronger for you." Tears filled her eyes, but she pushed through, her hand gently resting on the edge of Will's bed. "I didn't mean to make you feel like I gave up on you. I never, ever wanted that. I love you more than anything in this world, and I'm so sorry I made you doubt that." Will's face softened as he listened, his fingers gripping the letter in his lap. Chloe watched him, her heart aching with every second of silence that followed. She didn't know if he would respond, if he would forgive her. But then, after what felt like an eternity, Will spoke. His voice was soft, but the words were clear. "I forgive you, Mom." The simple sentence hung in the air, and for a moment, Chloe couldn't believe she had heard it. Her breath caught in her throat, and she reached for his hand, her heart swelling with relief and gratitude. Tears streamed down Chloe's face as she held Will's hand, the bond between them slowly repairing itself with that one small sentence. It wasn't everything, there were still wounds to heal, still things left unsaid. But it was enough to start. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Will looked at her, his own eyes damp, and for the first time in years, they shared a moment of understanding, of love. It was a small but powerful step toward healing, and Chloe knew that their journey wasn't over, but they were finally on the right path. Henry entered the room moments later, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. Chloe and Will sat together, their hands clasped, the tension that had once filled the air now replaced with something softer, something hopeful. He crossed the room and wrapped them both in a gentle embrace, his own tears falling as the family began to mend the pieces that had been broken for so long. They weren't fully healed, but they were together, and that was enough for now. The future felt uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, they were ready to face it, together. In the weeks following their emotional reconciliation, life began to take on a new rhythm for Henry, Chloe, and Will. Their days were filled with therapy sessions, medical consultations, and careful planning for Will's ongoing recovery. Chloe no longer carried the unbearable weight of guilt alone, instead, she leaned on Henry, and together they supported Will through every small victory. Will was still weak, his body slowly relearning what it had forgotten during his years in the coma, but each step forward, however small, was a triumph. Chloe's heart swelled with pride and hope every time Will managed a new milestone. The hospital became a place of healing rather than a reminder of pain. Chloe spent hours with Will, guiding him through his exercises, telling him stories from his childhood, and filling the room with love and encouragement. Henry continued to be her rock, offering steady support and keeping things light when the weight of their journey threatened to become too heavy. "One step at a time," he would say with a smile, echoing the optimism he had carried since the beginning. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in a long time, they could see the possibility of a future beyond the hospital walls. Will's recovery was slow but steady. His first words, hesitant but full of determination, gave both Chloe and Henry hope for the future. With every session of physical therapy, his strength returned, and though the road ahead was still long, they faced it together. Chloe found herself smiling more, her heart no longer burdened by the weight of guilt but filled with the love she had for her son. She and Henry worked side by side, determined to give Will the life he deserved. The cracks in their relationship had begun to heal, their bond stronger for having weathered the storm together. As Will's strength grew, so did the bond between the three of them. They weren't the same family they had been before the accident, they had changed, grown, but in many ways, they were stronger now. The quiet moments shared between them became more frequent, and the laughter that once filled their home began to return. Will's resilience inspired them both, and with each new accomplishment, Chloe and Henry felt their hope rekindle. They weren't fully healed, but they were on the road to healing, and that was enough for now. The future still held uncertainties, but they faced it together as a family, stronger and more united than ever. Will's recovery would take time, but Chloe and Henry had learned to cherish each small victory, to celebrate the progress rather than focus on the past. They had come through the darkest time in their lives, and now, as a family, they were ready to move forward into whatever came next, filled with a renewed sense of hope and love. Months passed, and the progress Will made was nothing short of miraculous. On a cool autumn morning, Henry and Chloe stood on either side of Will, each holding one of his hands as they walked down the quiet path outside the rehabilitation center. Will's steps were slow and hesitant, his legs still shaky from the years of immobility, but each step was a triumph. Chloe watched him with tears in her eyes, her heart full of pride. She glanced at Henry, who was grinning ear to ear, his eyes shining with joy. "You're doing great, buddy," Henry said, giving Will's hand a gentle squeeze. The leaves crunched softly beneath Will's feet as he focused on each step, his face set with determination. It was a far cry from the boy who once ran through the house with boundless energy, but to Chloe, this moment was more beautiful than any she could have imagined. The journey to this point had been long and filled with more pain than she thought she could bear, but now, watching her son walk again, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. This wasn't just Will's recovery, it was all of theirs. Chloe's mind flashed back to the day of the accident, the moment everything changed. The image of Will's fall had haunted her for years, but now, as she watched him walk forward, each step seemed to erase a little more of the pain. This moment was a symbol of their family's resilience, of the love and strength that had brought them through the darkest time in their lives. As Will took another step, more confident this time, Chloe felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They had made it through the storm. With every step, the past seemed to fall further behind them. Will smiled, looking up at his parents with a mixture of pride and joy. "I did it, Mom. I'm walking," he said, his voice filled with quiet amazement. Chloe's heart swelled as she knelt down to hug him, her tears spilling onto his shoulder. "You did, sweetheart. You really did." Henry crouched beside them, pulling both Will and Chloe into a tight embrace, their small family united in this quiet, beautiful victory. As they stood up and continued their slow walk, hand in hand, Chloe felt a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. They had come through so much, and yet here they were, walking toward a future that no longer felt uncertain or terrifying. The road ahead might still hold challenges, but for now, they had each other. Will's hesitant steps, supported by the hands of his parents, were the start of a new journey, a journey filled with hope, love, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow.